Good evening. My name is Elisa Petrosova, and I am a third year in the School of Art.
And my name is Sophie Schneider, and I'm a fourth-year student here in the School of Engineering. And it is our great pleasure to welcome you to the Great Hall. We are honored to be on this stage and would like to acknowledge how lucky we all are to have a space like this and the privilege to be part of the solutions in the fight for climate justice. Not only are we an academic institution committed to advancing public discourse, but we've carried a strong history of protest. On Friday, September 20th, students, professors, and President Laura Sparks left the Cooper Union to join the global climate strike.
There were over 2,500 events scheduled in 163 countries on all 7 continents. This day will forever be marked as a turning point in the fight for climate justice. Today, Bill McKibben and Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, intergenerational voices integral to the climate movement, will discuss the histories of climate revolutions and the discussion around climate that has now become a globally unavoidable subject. For this reason, we came together with engineering professor Amanda Simpson to curate Cooper Union Climate Week, a series of events that provide space for the Cooper Union and the larger community at hand to work across disciplines to discuss the most critical issue of our generation, the climate crisis. Unchecked capitalism has led to a blind comfort that has become unsustainable for our planet. The time is now to reject business as usual.
I came to the Cooper Union to try to better understand the engineer's role in the climate emergency. By connecting theory to practice and engineering design to a larger societal issue, I understood how I might be part of a solution to the climate crisis, and I discovered a way to be optimistic.
I took a course in my second year, and one thing became clear. The world I was preparing for would not exist. As an aspiring curator, I was stumped. I could not ignore all the signs that the world we were heading towards would not at all be the same as today. But I came to realize that culture is at the forefront of change, and that I actually could help. We invited Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson here tonight, who has inspired us with her holistic approach to understanding the intricacies of our ocean's health and their importance to our biosphere.
And Bill McKibben, who has dedicated his life's work to climate and whose writing and activism has helped create the conversation around climate justice today. Dr. Johnson is a marine biologist, policy expert, and Brooklyn native. She is founder and CEO of Ocean Collective, a strategy consulting firm for conservation solutions, and founder of Urban Ocean Lab, a think tank focused on coastal cities. As executive director of the Waite Institute, Dr. Johnson co-founded the Blue Halo Initiative and led the Caribbean's first successful island-wide ocean zoning effort. Previously, she worked on ocean policy at the EPA and NOAA and was a leader of the March for Science. Dr. Johnson earned a BA from Harvard University in Environmental Science and Public Policy and a PhD from Scripps Institution of Oceanography and Marine Biology. She is a passionate advocate for coastal communities and builds solutions for ocean justice and our climate crisis.
Bill McKibben is an author and environmentalist who in 2014 was awarded the Right Livelihood Prize. In 2013, he was the winner of the Gandhi Prize and the Thomas Merton Prize and holds honorary degrees from 18 colleges and universities. His 1989 book, The End of Nature, is regarded as the first book for a general audience about climate change and has appeared in 24 languages. He's gone to write a dozen more books. He is also the Schumann Distinguished Scholar in Environmental Studies at Middlebury College and a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and Foreign Policy, named him to their inaugural list of the world's 100 most important global thinkers.
This is the third event of Cooper Union Climate Week. We hope you come back for more of our scheduled events. Tomorrow evening, we will have a school-wide climate exhibition opening on the 5th and 6th floors of this building. And on Wednesday evening, we will hear from Fia Backstrom and Gabriela Salazar on the ways they integrate climate into their art practices.
Without further ado, please join us in welcoming Bill McKibben and Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson.
Hi. Hi.
Well,
Thanks for coming.
thank you for that very kind introduction.
Yeah, you got the full rundown.
That's it. Can I ask the first question?
Oh gosh, sure.
And we'll get to the collapse of the planet and the need to replace.
Don't worry, we won't skip the
need
apocalypse.
to replace our economic system wholesale and so on. But I always want to ask an ocean question first.
Okay. It's really big.
I've noticed, it's like takes up like a quarter of the whole planet or something, right?
71%. And gets 0.7% of the philanthropic funding.
I was, in case there's anybody in the audience who might want to donate, I'd say, I gave a talk at the Monterey Aquarium a year or two ago. So in return, they were giving me a tour behind the scenes, and it was fun. We were meeting penguins and so on. But then they took me into a room where there was a tank with an octopus in it. And there the tour ended because the octopus and I spent the next half hour just tentacling each other, you know. I kind of fell in love, and it kind of changed my mind in wild ways. Am I just being sentimental, or is there something special about octopuses, octopi?
It is octopuses. It's Greek, not Latin. I mean, he's a writer, right? We can be nerds here together. Octopus is my favorite ocean creature.
Is that right?
And they are amazing. I think there are two things that I won't let people eat in front of me. One is octopus and the other is shrimp. And octopus, because I'm like, it's probably smarter than you. Like, it's just weird. Just don't do it. But they can essentially think independently with each arm. And they have 3 hearts and this distributed brain. They can change the texture and the color of their skin, some of them. And they've been around for a long time. And if they lived longer than a few years, they would for sure kick us off of the planet. We're lucky that they have such short life cycles. They have been known to have like even separate personalities in different arms, and definitely can recognize individual people and have like opinions on whether they like you or not. So some of them, like if they don't like you, they'll like squirt water as you walk by and just like drench you. They make it very clear. There's a great book by Cy Montgomery called The Soul of the Octopus, where she gets to know octopuses in a few different aquaria, and highly recommend.
All right, good. Well, now I'm done for the evening, so
I've
learned what I want to know.
So I'm excited to be here with you. This is such a treat. And when we were thinking about what we wanted to chat about in front of a bunch of other folks, we were talking about sort of the arc of the climate movement. And you are an OG. You were there from the beginning. And so I'd love to hear from you kind of, what's the biggest surprise as someone who's been in this for a few decades? Like, what did you not see coming? Well,
I mean, let's talk science and then politics for a minute.
Yeah.
I mean, at some level, it's not like there's any surprises. Like we knew 30 years ago basically what we know now. Put carbon and methane into the atmosphere, their molecular structure traps heat, the planet warms up.
We actually knew that in 1856 because of Dr. Eunice Newton Foote, a woman who identified that CO2 was going to warm this planet.
And her experiments were quite elegant, and the
Totally
equipment
beautiful.
for it was really something. But it was really only in the late 1980s that we had the supercomputing capability to understand. I mean, your former colleagues at Scripps, beginning in the late 1950s, put up the most crucial piece of scientific instrumentation the world's ever seen, the CO2 monitor on the side of Mauna Loa that began tracking the steady rise in carbon. But by the 1980s, people had the supercomputing power to say, look, we're at the point where this is going to be a problem. But we didn't know in the late 1980s exactly how hard and fast it was going to pinch. And I think the story of those 30 years, it's pinched a lot harder and faster than we thought. Partly that's because scientists by nature are conservative, not exaggerated, just the opposite in their predictions. But mostly it's because this was an experiment we had not carried out before. And so the planet just turned out to be extremely finely balanced. The stuff that 30 years ago we thought would happen in 2080 or 2120 or something is happening right now. I mean, we've lost half the sea ice in the summer Arctic. So those are the, all the surprises on the physical side have been bad. Just the physics.
The projections only get worse.
The physics.
They're never like, actually, it's fine. We ran a new computer model and everything's
exactly.
fine.
And
that's never happened.
And none of the feedback loops turn out to be negative so far. All of them turn out to be positive.
Positive is a bad thing in this
right,
context.
Positive's bad.
Positive means like we're accelerating to hell.
Right. It's like when you go to the doctor and it comes back positive, not good.
Not good.
On the political side, I mean, it did not really occur to me that given this sort of set of data about the planet, our political leaders would choose to do nothing about it, that didn't seem to, obviously it's a hard problem, you have to change a lot, but the basic choice we would make is let's don't do anything was hard to kind of imagine. And I spent the first 10 or 15 years after I'd written that book, because I'm a writer and an academic, thinking that we were in an argument, and so that the job was to write more books, have more symposiums, conduct more conversations, produce more articles, so that eventually the weight of evidence would be so great that our, the powers that be would have no choice but to go to work. It took me much too long, and I kick myself sometimes for this, to figure out that we were not in an argument, we were in a fight. And the fight is what fights are always about, not data and reason, money, it's about money and power. And we now understand the dimensions of that fight. We've had good reporting in the last 10 years that's completely exposed precisely the fact that the fossil fuel industry knew everything there was to know about climate change in the 1980s, that they believed their scientists. I mean, Exxon began building all its drilling rigs to compensate for the rise in sea level they knew was coming. They just didn't tell the rest of us. They spent billions of dollars building the architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that kept us locked for 30 years in an utterly sterile debate about whether or not global warming was real. A debate that both sides knew the answer to from the start, just one of them was willing to lie, and it becomes the most consequential lie in human history because it costs us that 3 decades.
So one of those big sort of heaps of facts is the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, right? And I don't know if you remember this, but in the year 2000, I was a junior at Harvard, and you came and taught a seminar with Professor Jim McCarthy, who was one of the lead authors of the 3rd assessment report, and we had this thick binder with a draft of the report, and we spent the entire semester going through it, and that was my first exposure to the real breadth and depth of the science. Do you feel like those reports what kind of impact do you feel like those reports have had?
Well, so those were, this is one of the greatest chapters in the history of science. The fact that the scientific community was able to organize itself in short order to take on incredibly difficult and complicated problem in chemistry and physics, and by 1995 really produce a robust consensus around what we needed to do and how fast and things is remarkable. Now, as it turns out, the weakness of them was that, and this is not surprising, they were not good at communicating what they meant, you know? And
they didn't have like sassy infographics and memes attached to them.
No, they finally, this is one of the stories of what's happened in the last year and why we're in a climate moment now. Last year, asked to do, activists had managed somewhat unpredictable, somewhat counterintuitive. We managed to get into the Paris Accord this sentence about trying to keep the temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And as a result of that, which at the time none of the negotiators thought was very important and they were all focused on, as a result of that, the IPCC was asked to provide a report on this particular thing. And this time for once, the IPCC managed to communicate extraordinarily effectively. It put a deadline on it. It said, if you're not far along on this work by 2030, you will never get there. And that number was one of the 2 or 3 things in the last year that's just galvanized things.
So that's this number of like, we have 10 years or 11, you know. And I know there's been a bunch of debate about that number and whether that's useful or if it's like, you know, sort of misleading. But it certainly has rallied people around like this sense of urgency that's been missing. And
Right.
so I guess the analog that I think of in the ocean world is when we had this reporting on the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, all this plastic. People like, there's a plastic island, and actually it's like most of the plastic is smaller than your pinky fingernail, and like it's not actually all on the surface. It's
you
like
can't
down
walk
to 10
on it,
meters depth.
yes.
You can't walk on it, and like you can't actually see it from space and all this stuff. But like it created this image in people's minds. It was almost like the inaccuracy of the journalism was a gift because people were now like, uh-oh, there's an island the size of Texas of plastic in the middle of the ocean. And I was just like, it's not quite true, but I'm kind of like glad you messed that one up. So, because now the only thing anyone wants to talk to me about is like, what do we do about the plastic in the ocean? Like, just stop using plastic. I mean, there's no cute answer, really. I was telling you this backstage about this super well-dressed guy in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, where I grew up and live now, who was walking down the street with one of these like plastic iced coffee cups, you know, walking to the train, and I'm just kind of annoyed at all the single-use everything, but I get it, it happens. We don't have good alternatives often. But he had a stainless steel straw in it, and I just totally want to slap it out of his hand and be like, bro, you're missing the point. Like, I guess this is like on brand for you, but like, oh, this is so symbolic of the way that we want to do like some little thing and pretend that that's enough. And it wasn't until like maybe last year, maybe 2 years ago, that I realized that whatever you all think of Al Gore, the title of that film is actually incredible.
Really good.
Inconvenient Truth. And because our lifestyles are going to have to change, like everything is going to have to change. As Naomi Klein titles her book, this changes everything, right? So I think there's this like, the power of journalism and framing is something that I'm only just recently appreciating, and it's something that you've been working on for so long.
So, I mean, the key is you do have to be, I mean, and this is the good thing about the IPCC, you do have to be, if you're not accurate, eventually it catches up. And in fact, their thing about 10 years is actually comes much closer to being true than what I think people thought before, which is we have a long time, this problem exists someplace in the future, it's my children that I'm worried about. They managed to say, no, really, please, right now. This is the moment that we have. Because, and this is something that was hard for people to understand, we're used to thinking about political problems in ways that we're used to the idea that you'll keep coming back to them over and over again. So Trump completely screws up healthcare, and it's horrible for people who are suffering from that. Can't get insurance, some of them are going to die, and a lot of people are going to be sick and go bankrupt and whatever. But at the end of it, whenever we finally come to our senses, it won't make it more difficult to deal with the problem of healthcare. Sooner or later, our country will decide, like all other industrialized countries in the world, that it's going to have good healthcare for people, and that'll be that. That's not true with climate change. It's the first time test we ever got, you know? And if you don't
I
solve
threw
it
up on my
soon,
first time test in the craft sink.
that's it.
Really didn't go well for me.
This goes to a scientific question I wanted to ask you, which is even in 2000, when we were doing that at Harvard, you know, and things, the one, that must have been remarkable for a young marine biologist to suddenly be contemplating that the single most salient fact of the thing you were literally immersing yourself in was now shifting in front of your eyes. What was that like?
Of all the shifts that we've created with the climate, that's the one that just really blows my mind, because the ocean is enormous, and we've managed to change the pH of the entire ocean.
You stick a pH strip in the ocean and it comes out a different color than it would have 30 years ago.
The ocean is more acidic than it used to be, and that has huge implications that we're only just starting to understand the science of. So obviously, if the water's more acidic, it's harder for things to grow skeletons and shells, so that's really bad for corals and oysters. But there's weird effects that, like, no one predicted. And the one that blows my mind is, because the chemistry of seawater has changed, like, if you're a fish, you're like smelling liquid, right? And so there are fish that no longer run away from predators because they don't smell them coming anymore. Like, how bananas is that? Like, we're screwing up predator-prey interactions because we're changing the chemistry and the smell of the ocean, which is like how fish navigate. And it's hard for people to grow oysters, which is actually one of the most sustainable sources of protein. It's arguably more sustainable than being vegan, because it's just, you don't have to feed it or water it. It just like filters its food out of the seawater. And so that does really kind of blow my mind. And it's the way that I remember how vast an impact we can have on this planet. And that's pretty scary. But there are, in the same way that we can draw carbon out of the atmosphere through plants on land, we can also do that in the ocean. And there are ways to reduce ocean acidification locally by controlling the runoff of fertilizers and other chemicals from shore, and also planting more seaweeds. And they absorb that CO2, so that locally that makes a difference. So the thing that I kind of want to like shout all the time into every microphone, and I'll move it away from my mouth before I shout it, but is like, photosynthesis! It's like, that's the answer, right? And people are finally like, oh, we should plant more trees. I'm like, yes, and seaweed, and like, we need to do it on land and in the ocean. So how, did you see this coming? This like wave of tree planting that's sweeping the planet?
Yeah, people have been talking about it forever, but of course, it's always, and it is a beautiful solution and something we should be doing, but we have a tendency to decide that whatever thing we've just heard of is like the answer that will then
there have
solve
been worse
the
trends,
problem.
for sure.
There's a, we don't have enough land on which to grow enough trees to by itself solve the problem. We actually, the newest data I've seen, and it's really interesting, is you do even better by leaving the trees that are growing, because trees
We've got some tree lovers in the house tonight.
Well, somewhat to the surprise of the arborist community, the data indicates that trees actually get better they sequester more carbon in the second quarter century of their life than in the first, and more in the third than in the second, and so on. So that would be a priority.
So stop cutting down trees.
Stop cutting
Plant
down
more trees.
Definitely do not, whatever you do, don't cut down trees to
Old
turn
trees.
them into pellets to burn for electricity. That's not a good idea. And it's, in fact, what's now happening across the southeast United States. We're shipping them in huge ships off to Europe to burn because in the EU and now in the United States, they've somehow been listed as carbon neutral sources of power. So, I mean, there's a number of really bad ideas that, many ideas taken to a certain scale.
Give us like your top 3 bad ideas.
That's definitely
Yeah.
on the
What else you got?
top of the list. I mean, it turns out that growing corn in order to produce gasoline was a pretty poor idea too.
That's
Like,
also not going
the
well.
energy balance doesn't work
Yeah.
out. I don't know.
And just the amount of pesticides that
Yeah.
are often used to do that, and like, oh, it's so
and the
bad.
amount of land it takes up, and so on and so forth. The real question here is, I mean, when there are 100 good things we should be doing, none of which will make much difference if we do not quickly stop burning coal and gas and oil. That's the essential thing to do, and the trouble is that's the hardest part. Not because we don't have alternatives. I mean, the engineers have done a beautiful job. A solar panel costs 1/10 what it does a decade ago. It's the hardest thing to do because the fossil fuel industry is the richest industry on Earth, and they use that wealth and power to make sure that they're literally willing to break the planet to keep their business model going another decade or two. And so that's why we fight so hard about things like, that's why we were so happy last week when the University of California announced that it was divesting their $80 billion endowment and pension. That's why we kind of wish Cooper Union would do the same thing soon.
Are you guys next?
Yeah.
Can we make this happen?
You know.
So what's the third worst idea?
I don't know. What's on your list of?
Fracking is a terrible idea. Correct.
That's actually really important to say.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, I think, so my mother worked on New York's fracking ban. She worked behind the scenes on that, and one of the things that she did was think about the geology of New York State and how much of it is really porous karst. And so she called a geologist. There's just this thing about your generation that's just I know, I'll just call a geologist. And so she calls a geologist and is like, so here's what I need. We need to ban fracking.
As opposed to your
Here's the
generation that's going to text the geologist, yes. Yes.
I hop into the DMs and be like, hey, geologist. So my mom calls this geologist and says, we need you to overlay a map of New York State's aquifers, all of our groundwater, with all of the fractures and fault lines, and so that we can look at how those are synchronized and prove that fracking will lead to expanding these fractures, which will lead to polluting our drinking water. And then she submits this to the Department of Environmental Protection for their environmental impact statement. She's like, it seems like you missed this information when you were doing your analysis. I think she paid this guy $500 out of her pension monthly payment back when New York State had good pensions for their school teachers, and was that was her contribution. And I was just why didn't I think of this?
So this was a triumph of science, the whole
Absolutely.
story. I mean, people used to think, and I mean by used to 10 years ago, that natural gas, fracked gas, was the bridge fuel to the future. It was actually scientists at Cornell, Bob Howarth, Tony Ingraffia, others, who actually were the first to do the work to demonstrate that when you fracked things, you leaked so much methane into the atmosphere that this stuff was worse than coal. This message still has not gotten really through. Yeah. I was in Congress last week with Greta Thunberg, and there was some congressman going on and on about how America has, dramatically cut its greenhouse gas emissions in the last 20 years. It hasn't. Our carbon emissions have gone way down because we replaced our coal-fired power plants with natural gas-fired power plants. The result is that our methane emissions went way up and our greenhouse gas emissions are pretty much level. We haven't done hardly anything.
So you co-founded 350.org with a bunch of undergrads, and the focus has been on divestment and stopping fossil fuel infrastructure. Is that right?
That's right.
And so you've been sort of like trying to dismantle the fossil fuel. Is the fossil fuel industrial complex
That
a thing?
would be good,
Okay.
yeah.
Take it down.
The carbon industrial complex.
And so one of my questions for you is, how does that focus include or exclude people? Because as someone who's like much more motivated by the future, by like building the future than fighting the past, I've always thought like, that's incredible work. I'm so glad they're doing it. I also want to think about like all of the ways to draw down carbon and like build the future that we need. And I know like stopping that is a part of it, but I'm wondering like, have you thought about with your colleagues how the movement can expand to bring in more people, because they're excited about like, how do we get to this future once we like, we need to do both at the same time, right? Like tear down the past and build the future.
So absolutely. I mean, what's now I'm afraid, mostly my side work as a writer, that's what I love to do. The books that I've, Deep Economy, and the books that really matter to me are books that I've written that are really about what the future might look like and where we might go. In fact, I have the cover story in Time magazine this week that's kind of about looking back from 2050. And one of the great things that's happened over the last few years is this movement has now finally expanded so that there's enough people that we can do more than the absolute single most important triage work of trying somehow to take down the fossil fuel industry. It is so good to see so many people bringing so many gifts, including the kind of gift of prophecy, to this fight, and I love it.
So you and I were backstage together at the climate strike a few days ago, and we were watching. It was amazing, correct? I think I was the oldest speaker. I was so honored to be invited by the youth leaders. I think it made up for like every party I never got invited to in high school. I was like, finally, I'm cool, this is amazing. And I stayed up until like 3 a.m. working on my speech because I didn't want to let these kids down, right? And you and I are watching as Greta goes on stage. And it was this moment where I felt like I was part of a 3-generation movement. And that felt incredible. Because as you have been working on this for so long, it must be nice to have like a bigger team.
You think it feels incredible to you? I mean, it is so wonderful to see. Well, it's so wonderful to see your retirement policy in front of you. Like to know that there are other people to carry on this fight. I mean, the first few years when I was doing this, part of the problem for me was that there was no one. I mean, no one else wrote a really good book about it for several years after I did. For years, if there was a story in a magazine, the odds were very high that it was written by me. And so there was no one to like, I had to kind of, I mean, not only was I dealing with the kind of like, this is horrible, the world, but also like, am I crazy because there's no one else that seems to be reacting the same way to this news that I am? Maybe I've just, gone nuts, or something's wrong, or I'm overreacting, or something. So it is incredibly good. And one of the best things about what's happened, the thing I liked, I mean, the climate strike on Friday was great. 350 helped serve as the kind of logistical backbone to this around the world, because we have this sort of network around the world. And it was so much fun to watch, as it always is. We've done 7 or 8 of these global days of action over the last decade, but this was by far the biggest, and to watch those pictures come in from around the world was amazing. One of the things that was so amazing, and you really felt it down in the Battery, was that demonstration looked like New York. It was as completely diverse as this city is. It just finally felt like, okay, this really...
I mean, there was this amazing DJ spinning Afro beats to warm up the crowd, and then it's like Jaden and Willow Smith performing. It was like, can teenagers run all protests?
It was really good. And the pictures from around the world were equally poignant and beautiful. I I started crying once, maybe twice, but
Oh my God, I
once.
cried like 10 times.
Once there was a picture from Kabul of these girls who had left school, maybe 75 or 80, and did a little march the street. And of course, that's not safe. So there were soldiers in front and back with. I mean, to be a girl and go to school in Afghanistan is brave, much less not go to school,
and strike. And they were being protected by these guys with like machine guns.
It was powerful. The other one that was just got me was the very first picture that came in. One of our greatest sets of networks is in the South Pacific that we've built up over the years. And the first picture that came in, because the sun rises first in the South Pacific, was in the Solomon Islands. And it was a bunch of kids arriving by dugout canoe at the main island to have their strike. The thing, if there's one thing that's most important to always remember about climate change, is that it's the iron law of climate change is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and harder you get hit by it. And that that weighs heavily. It should weigh heavily on all of us here all the time. And it really, that's why it's so beautiful to see the planet come together in a day. I mean, I'm not sure if I've spent a lot of time in Bangladesh and places over the years. I'm not sure if I was a Bangladeshi, I'd even be willing to work with the rest of the world on, it's like, yeah, you're, I mean, they didn't do anything to cause the Bay of Bengal to rise and, destroy half the fields with salt and, stop start the glaciers melting at the other end of the Brahmaputra and whatever. I might be tempted to just say to Westerners, go away, leave it, you've done enough, But instead, people really willing to, so whenever I start to get a little despairing or lazy or whatever else, I kind of think about that. And it's like, okay, we can do this.
That reminds me of this question of climate refugees, right? I mean, we're predicting 10 million or more climate refugees out of Bangladesh, hundreds of millions around the world. And we saw just after the hurricane in the Bahamas, which was so devastating, that the US is turning away a boat of just a few Bahamians and saying they're dangerous. And so that to me was just such a good reminder about how all of these justice issues are intertwined, right? Like, it's our immigration policy and our climate policy and our agricultural policy.
It's so crucial. I got arrested last month, which is not as unusual for me as you probably should be.
I mean, it might better you than me, maybe. I don't know.
It was at a climate. We did this upstate New York, and there was a climate sort of immigration protest with a kind of climate emphasis because just what you say. I mean, this is really one of the places where the rubber is meeting the road. I mean, there's already millions of people on the move, and there'll be 1 billion people. It's never fun to get arrested, but there felt something right about, you're sitting in the basement of the jail, shackled at the ankle to the, wall of the jail. And I'm sort of thinking, really, the only immigration policy that we've come up with so far is cages and walls, and that's not okay for a century in which huge parts of humanity are going to have no choice to move and are going to be on the move through no fault of their own. A lot of the people who've ended up at the southern border, we now know, are leaving the highlands of Honduras and Guatemala because it is too dry to grow food in fields where people have grown food for dozens of generations, and now they can't. It's not their fault. They were not burning the fossil fuel that caused the problem. We better come up with some ethic of solidarity that allows us to, which goes to an equally difficult point, which is we're going to have a lot of internal changes too. I want to ask you about the work you're doing with the Urban Ocean Lab. I mean, this is, we're on the edge of the East Village here. It was not that long ago during Sandy when the East River turned, Avenue A was a branch of the East River for a while. I mean, there were whitecaps, down on the, on the Lower East Side. How should people in cities like New York now be thinking about what's coming at them?
So the Urban Ocean Lab is this new entity that I'm co-founding around this question of what should be the future of coastal cities. And it's a question that doesn't have enough attention right now, because a third of Americans live in coastal cities. And nowhere really has a plan for the amount of, for example, sea level rise that's coming. We're looking at multiple meters of sea level rise, likely, potentially, by the end of this century. And we've had a foot so far. And Hurricane Sandy didn't even hit at high tide, right? So just imagine if it were like a Category 3 that hits at high tide. We're just not ready. And I think, so we're thinking about the nexus of design and like envisioning what the future of coastal cities could look like, and then also developing the policy framework that will help us get there. And I think mixing those two things is super important, because we have to be able to see the future that we're working towards. I think that's been a big part of the problem in the climate movement. There's been like the apocalypse. The apocalypse story has been very clear. Like, we know the like fire and brimstone and flooding and storms version of the future, but we haven't actually done a great job of painting what the future looks like.
Give an example. Think about the Lower East Side of Manhattan.
Yeah. And so, like, does New York City need to look more like Venice, Italy? What does it look like to think about everything within a meter of the current sea level being turned into parkland? What does it look like as a start to say, we're not building anything new in areas that we know are flooding? I mean, there are still like, someone sent me a picture of Miami Beach the other day, and there were like 7 cranes in the picture. Everywhere. They're like still building in places that we know are unsafe. And so I think of it as like, devastating as it is, every storm, every increasingly unnatural disaster is an opportunity for us to think about not just how we rebuild, but if we rebuild, which is a horrible conversation to have, but like, that's where we are, right? Like, is the Bahamas gonna rebuild and pretend that the next hurricane's not gonna come? Are we gonna keep rebuilding on the coastline of New York every single time, or are we gonna use this as a forcing mechanism to think about how we actually move people and infrastructure out of harm's way? And so if Urban Ocean Lab achieves nothing else but making people think realistically about this confluence of millions of people and a rising ocean and the storm surge associated with that, I would be really pleased, because to me right now it's like, it's the thing that's like too big to talk about. Like, we talk about the heat and we talk about the changes in the weather, but we don't talk about just like the huge amount of land that's going to be inundated.
Right, and those who do, I mean, I was in North Carolina the other day, talking with some of the Stan Riggs and some of the really good oceanographers who've been trying to get, literally the state legislature passed a law that you could not use new sea level data in planning for coastal zoning. Like, literally,
this
you weren't
is
allowed
why
to do
I got
it.
involved in the March for Science, because I was just like, you guys, science is super useful. The scientific method is awesome. Like, we should definitely be using this to make policy decisions. Like, how can we? I mean, it's just so ridiculous. So I have 2 rings. Let's talk about our rings. I have 2 rings. And after I was one of the leaders of the March for Science, I got this brass ring that says science. And it's kind of like old school Brooklyn script, right? And then I was like, science is not enough. Like, definitely we need the science, and we should make decisions based on science, but like, we're gonna need a little bit of magic. So I have 2, these are the 2 rings that I wear every day. They're stacked. It's like science and magic. And I think for me, the magic, it's not like David Copperfield magic. It's like that spark that we saw at the climate strike, this like energy, this new wave of leadership, this building community around solutions, this realization that we're all in this together, this energy to vote people out of office.
I think go back one, that we're all in this together may turn out to be the key. I mean, you look, we've been raised in our time and in our culture and in our economy to be hyper individuals. That's, because that's what maximized for growth and whatever else, That's not going to work going forward. I mean, everything that we're talking about requires solidarity of some kind as, first principle to be able to do
I
it.
was speaking with a bunch of philanthropists a week or two ago, and I was like, climate is the one thing your money will not save you from. It'll buy you a little bit of time. Like, you can buy better healthcare, you can buy better food, we all know you can buy your way into a better education, but like, you can't actually get out of climate change. This whole Mars thing is just like a huge distraction.
That's where my last book ended, was at Cape Canaveral watching Musk launch one of his rockets. There is something scary about the fact that the one thing that unites all the richest people on the planet is they want to leave, It's a bad sign.
So this ring on your right hand, does that have a climate meaning?
That's a turtle. I like turtles a lot.
I mean, you can't see it, but I have questions.
There are days when I like to just draw in, and huddle under my shell.
Same.
It's and that's really something we probably should talk about for a minute, because there's a lot of people who are coming more recently to this thing, and there is trying to figure out how you deal with angst is a real thing. It's one of the things I love, and I mean love, watching the youth climate movement. It also kills me that 14-year-olds are spending all their time having to think about how they're going to
wake the grown-ups up.
Think about what it says about a society that we've essentially assigned the most difficult problem we've ever faced to like junior high school students to deal with, I mean, thank God they're good at it. I'll tell you, you want to hear a story about Greta in Washington last week? Because it was my favorite moment of the week. She was at the Foreign Relations Committee testifying, and some Republican congressman was just gassing on minute after minute, just about, and all he was talking about, just over and over again, he's like, China, if China is doing, why should America do anything? China. Well, I mean, there's lots of ways to answer that, including the fact that China is now reducing its emissions, building renewable energy at the fastest. But Greta, to her great credit, didn't bother falling into any of those. After 5 minutes of this, she looked up at the guy and said, quietly, she said, I come from a small country called Sweden. And in Sweden, some people say, why should we bother doing anything? Because the United States is so big and wastes so much. Just so you know, she said. I was like...
There was also an element of like, and pollution. They were talking about pollution as well. Like, the ocean is full of plastic, so like, why should we stop? And she was like, well, of course the answer is you pick it up, and then you get all your friends to help you pick it up, and then you get the people who are putting it in to stop doing it. Like, of course that's what you do. But the moment backstage, when you and I were watching her go on, and she was carrying her sign that she always carries, her school strike for climate sign, there was this huge realization that I had when I saw the back of her sign. Has anyone seen the back of her sign ever? It's wood.
It's heavy.
This girl was in it for the long haul from the very beginning, and she bought a thin piece of plywood and she painted it. Because this is a movement, this is a transformation that we all have to be committed to for the rest of our lives. And seeing how she knew that from the time she made her first sign, if that was paper, it would just have fallen apart, week 3. And she was like, she knew that this was going to be a long-term fight. And it's just so amazing to see these young people be able to frame things and commit to this in this magnificent way.
So let's go to this despair question for a minute, back to it, because I think it's important. And let me ask it to you as a kind of marine biologist way. I'm not. I live in the mountains. The woods are my natural habitat and things. But I do love the ocean. I was doing organizing, fighting this coal mine in Australia 18 months ago or so. While I was there, some of the people said, okay, we want you to come see this thing. And they took me out on a boat under the Great Barrier Reef, and the captain was the guy who had taken David Attenborough to the place where they filmed that part of Blue Planet where it's the coral is spawning, and it's like this most incredibly beautiful fertility rite that the world, you could ever possibly imagine. Once a year, this explosion of, it's unbelievable.
Coral's amazing. It's like 3.5 hours after, 8 days after, 3.5 hours after sunset, 8 days after the full moon or something in September. It's like they know what they're doing. On schedule. I don't tell my PhD advisor that I'm like totally botching those exact specifications right now.
We go out to exactly the same GPS coordinates.
Yeah.
We dive precisely on the same spot. This is 3 years later. And it's like diving on a parking garage. There's nothing living there. Every single coral, for as far as you could see through your face mask, has been bleached by this way. So
they just can't take the heat.
I didn't know how to deal with
Yeah.
it sort of emotionally. How do you deal with that emotionally when you watch that happen?
I cry.
Yeah.
I think there's a few sort of very human reactions, right? There's like sadness, and there's rage, and there's depression, and there's sort of like resignation. And I guess I'm lucky that my natural response is sadness. I don't get depressed.
I default to rage. So
I wish I did, because I feel like that's like more cathartic. But I definitely cry like almost every day when I read the news. And it's not like weeping, and it doesn't last very long, but I tear up.
Yep.
And I let myself feel that.
That was definitely the emotion when I wrote The End of Nature, because there weren't yet things going on, so there wasn't things to be, one wasn't exactly afraid, but it was clear what was coming, and that what was coming was that human beings were going to have affected every square centimeter of the planet, and it felt sad. It was the right emotion for that.
And the thought that we could drive an entire ecosystem, coral reefs extinct, in my lifetime.
Which is, by the way, if you read that IPCC report on 1.5 degrees, as you know, it says if we hold it to 1.5 degrees, we'll lose 95% of the world's coral reefs. If we go to 2 degrees, we'll lose 99% of the. There's no good news.
And 500 million people depend on them for their nutrition and livelihood.
Yep.
So it's not just like no more pretty scuba diving. This is it, right? And so, those things make me cry. But the thing that I actually cry the most about is just the magnificence of the people coming together.
Amen. Me
to
too.
try to solve this, and they're not getting paid, and it's really inconvenient, and they're doing it anyway, and their signs are hysterical. And I get totally overwhelmed when people do the right thing and they don't have to. And so I'm crying a lot more for that reason
Me too.
These days.
Which is, which is a way of saying, people are here listening. What I've found, and I think that's what you're saying, is that the greatest antidote to that despair and angst, whatever, is action of some reasonable kind. And
do something, anything, and then more things.
Do figure out how to, figure out the most effective. My thinking on this is, don't feel that you have to come up with a brand new thing to do. People have put together movements now that are of a scale and a size that joining in
it's
with
okay
other
to be
people
a follower.
matters.
We can't, yeah.
And it's,
So that actually strikes me in the new leadership that we're seeing. It's not just a new, younger generation. It's specifically girls. And I think that there's something really special there, that these teenage girls are not too shy to follow each other. They're like, this is an awesome trend. I'm going to make a very similar sign. I'm going to sit somewhere also iconic, and like, we're going to start this thing together. So you've seen this happen. How do you feel about this like uprising of the feminist climate renaissance?
It's so good. It's so, I mean, environmentalism was, if you look back in its somewhat checkered history in many ways, has generally been a kind of white male preoccupation. And in fact, I remember the first global day of action on climate was the one we organized 10 years ago this fall at 350.org. It was of a similar expanse as what we saw Friday, 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries, but they were all small, 50 people here, 500 people there, 1,000 people there, because it had never been done before. Movements have to start someplace, and grow. Well, as we were watching the pictures come in, our killer, this was before Facebook and Twitter really, our killer app was Flickr, and we were having people download pictures from around the world. And I'd always been told that environmentalism was something that rich white people did, and that if you didn't know where your next meal was coming from, you would not be an environmentalist because you'd have other things on your mind and stuff. It took about
False.
took about 20 minutes of watching these pictures come in to realize that almost everybody we were working with around the world was poor, black, brown, Asian, young, because that's what almost everybody on Earth is,
And they're on the front lines.
They're on the front. Well, they're on all the lines. But yes, very much on the front lines, and exactly as interested in the future as anybody else.
Within the U.S. too. The polling data is actually really stunning. So it's like 50. This is 3-year-old data now, but like 54% of people of color think that climate change and like at the federal policy level should be a government priority, compared to 22% of white people. And that is actually diverging as fewer and fewer white folks thought it was a priority. And there's, my favorite turn of phrase from the Environmental Voter Project's founder, Nathaniel Stinnett, is that it's more likely that you'd have a Latina grandmother in Arizona prioritizing climate policy than a white college kid in New England, because these are communities that that are near power plants, that are worried about the changes in climate on farm workers and all of these things.
None of which means that if you're a white college kid, or more likely professor or whatever, you get a pass.
You get like whatever's the opposite of a pass.
Your job is you got sort of double. And some of this work. So that's where the leadership in the movement's coming from.
So 350 was started by a bunch of white kids and you in Vermont.
Yeah.
And that was, the largest U.S. climate grassroots organization.
Yeah.
Do you think that founding story and group was part of the reason it took so long to diversify? Did it scare people off?
No, I don't think so. We went global immediately and became, incredibly diverse very fast. But there was a kind of older generation of environmentalism that took a long time to do that, because it was just tied up in its thing. Now, let's be clear that people who have particular amounts of power in our society need particularly to figure out how to use that. Sometimes it's political power, and sometimes it's financial power. I wrote this piece in the New Yorker last week about what I think is going to be the next front in this fight. I think we're going to be, along with taking on the fossil fuel companies, we're finally at the point where we have no choice but to take on the banks and the asset managers and the insurance companies that are providing them, which I don't especially want. Look, having thrown myself on the, against the fossil fuel companies, I have some sense of how much fun it will be to, get to go up against the absolute center of capitalism but it's necessary to do. And that's a particular case where people who have money and assets and connections and things in that world are going to be called upon to, look, most of the world doesn't have a credit card, so it can't by definition, can't cut up its credit card and cause trouble for Chase, you know? So people who do have credit cards, much less people who have, stock portfolios, that's where we're going to need to be a lot of the organizing now going forward. A picture that sticks in my mind from one of these demonstrations that we think 350's organized about 20,000 demonstrations in every country but North Korea now over the years. And the one that sticks in my mind is a very small one in a town in Haiti called Lake K on the southwest peninsula there in Haiti. It sticks in my mind for two reasons. One, 2 years after it got taken, Hurricane Florence, I think, or one of them, Matthew, I guess, wiped out the city. 80% of the buildings were destroyed. I've tried to find out, but we've never been able to find out if the kids who are in this picture are still alive. Really nothing, if you can't burn less fossil fuel, if you're not burning any already, you're obviously not going to get to go from Haiti to the White House to protest, because we don't let Haitians in for any reason, definitely not to go protest things. There's way more stock portfolio in this room tonight than there is in that entire province of Haiti, So there is a sense in which places like Lower Manhattan have got to now mobilize in the biggest possible way. I mean, some of the problems in the White House, clearly, and it'll be good, when someone else is there. But even when, but even when she's taken over,
he's so dramatic.
Even when she's taken over in Washington, there's going to be an even bigger concentration of power located in the 40 blocks directly south of where we're sitting. So we're going to be needing you guys to do your share of the work going forward.
So one of the things that I'm really excited about as my role in this work is expanding from ocean conservation to climate work, is thinking about what it means to have the mic and how I can share that and how we can have a more diverse set of voices and stories and angles, because I honestly feel like we're ready to have a much more complicated and nuanced conversation about climate, right? Yes, zero emissions and get off of fossil fuels, but there's a lot more to it. And so I've been working a lot on building this community of incredible women who are doing this work, and I'm wondering if you and your OG white guy colleagues are thinking about how you guys can help pass the mic and elevate the next group of voices.
If you go look at this is sort of about 5 years ago, I stepped down as the board chair at 350 and things. And basically, my work these last years has been trying to figure out how to uplift voices from around it's why I like doing things like tonight so much. If you go look at my Twitter feed, if you could do a word cloud out of I spend a lot of time Twittering because I have a huge Twitter following.
You are very good at Twitter.
And the word by far that comes up most is just thanks. I'm always saying thank, because it moves me so much to see. And I think the reason for that is because there was so long when there wasn't anyone else doing it. And it feels so good to see people like you now taking control of the conversation and figuring out how to move us in all kinds of directions.
Saying thank you, I'm
all
for
it. So hiring people,
yeah.
Putting people for, I went down on last week.
They call that clicktivism.
I went down to Houston last week to give a talk, which I didn't really want to do.
My bad.
But there's a set of climate justice activists down there, led by a group called Tejas from the barrio that I love and I've worked hard with over the years and to promote. And so I knew that if I went down I said to the guy running the thing, I'll come down and speak, but you have to let this guy stand up and talk to your audience for 10 minutes too. And it was worth the trip just for that, because all these people who, came out had to hear and listen to him and see a different reality than they were used to seeing. That kind of work's really important. It's climate change, they don't call it global warming for nothing. I mean, this is the first thing we ever faced that really is global in its meaning, and it's the place where we absolutely have to figure out how to bring everybody on board. If we don't, we can't make it happen. My last book was dedicated to my favorite, in some ways, colleague in all this work, a woman from Fiji named Kareti Tiamalu, who died much too young, who led a lot of our work there. And just the privilege of getting to kind of be, work with her all the time and work with people all over the world. We have to end, so this will be the last thing I say, then you can say. We don't know if
He's giving me the last word. See, it's totally working.
We don't know if we're going to win this fight. I mean, we're definitely not going to win this fight, right? Like, there's huge losses already, and there are going to be much huger losses in the years ahead, just because there's a lot of lag in this system. And even if we did everything right at this point, the temperature is going to keep going up for quite a while, and then, on and on. And we don't know if we're going to win. We could. It's possible, as you know, there are scientists who think we've actually waited too long to get started, and that the momentum now behind the warming of the planet is so great that we want. The most consensus science is we still have a narrow window, albeit one that's closing, to change quickly such that we can limit the rise of temperature to the point where it doesn't cut off civilization at its knees. But that's, as I say, a narrow and closing window. So the work is urgent. But since we don't know if we're going to win, the fight itself has to be part of the point, And so it has to be, because it's the fight of our lifetimes, it has to be a beautiful fight, It has to be a fight that lets us be more human, not less, more connected, not less, more, more human than we've allowed ourselves to be. Tell us about one of the things I want you to do is tell us about the title of your book that you're close to, that's coming out before too long, because it's a beautiful title and it gets right at that.
I'm going to write a book because I want to join the club that you're in. And it's not about the ocean. It's about this question of how humans survive harm. And that's the big question, right? And there's more to it than climate. It's about climate and science and policy and justice and community and love and all the things that drive us. It's about how technology is probably not the answer, but can be handy. What's the future of food and islands and cities and conservation and diversity? And so I think there's this moment where people are waking up to this interconnectedness of all of these challenges. And thankfully, it's happening in this moment where there are 3 generations of people actively pushing for these major societal and economic and cultural transformations that we need. And I think the biggest gift that the youth movement has given us is this moral clarity. I think it's so easy as you get older to be like, everything's about compromise, and that's totally fine. And we'll just take what we can get, and we fought hard. And these kids are just not messing around. And I think that is so critical to remember that some things are right and some things are wrong. And having that kind of stark perspective is not naive. It's just clear. And I want us all to sort of hold on to that. Hold on to this like youthful moral clarity, and I think that's what keeps me going.
That's the place to end. Thank you so much for this.
Thanks for coming.